their part of the bargain is to think through the tough ideas. And of course, there are also differences. I have, they're exams for my students, not for my readers. I have a textbook in addition to my popular book for my students that shows the original data, the graphs, the details of the studies, so they're not just getting a digest of the conclusions, but they actually see how the original studies were done. So there are differences.
If I walked into your classroom, would I see an active debate?
You would see in the lectures not a lot of, it depends. In my big lecture classes, not in the lecture hall so much, but in the discussion sections. So I always have discussion sections of 15 students where there is debate. In my seminars, more like a dozen people instead of 300 people, then lots, yeah.
Oklahoma City, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Pinker. Has your work been influenced in any way by Wittgenstein's work or his concepts of cognitive thought, and if so, how? And what would Wittgenstein say of the tabula rasa concept? Thank you.
Okay. I have been influenced by Wittgenstein in the following specific way. Namely, Wittgenstein pointed out that a lot of human concepts don't have crisp definitions that characterize them perfectly. His famous example was a game. What do all games have in common? Or what's the definition of game? Well, it can't be winners and losers, because you've got solitaire, you've got a kid throwing a ball against a wall. It can't be physical activity, because you've got chess, and no matter what you try to put into the definition, you can find counterexamples. So he suggested that human concepts are family resemblance categories. That is, the different games, or the different tools, the different vegetables, each subset shares different properties, the way pairs of members of a family might share hair color or nose or eye color, without everyone having one thing in common or some number of things in common. So I think that was a great insight about human conceptual categories, which I've written about a number of times. On the other hand, I think Wittgenstein was, in other ways, not so sympathetic, or I'm not so sympathetic to his approach. There was something behavioristic about Wittgenstein, in the sense that he did not take seriously mental representations as contents of the mind. I think he would have thought it a mistake to even talk about the kind of things that I like to study, like mental images, like rules of language, like mental representations of the meaning of a sentence. I think Wittgenstein would have said that those were all confusions, but I take them quite seriously as a non-behaviorist.
Mesa, Arizona.
My question for Dr. Pinker has to do with language and the choice of language we use in everyday normal life. And I'm talking about English, French, Spanish, and how these things relate to the First Amendment and the guarantees for free speech therein. When we think of free speech, we usually think of it as guaranteeing lofty principles like political thought or art expression. But I'm talking about ordinary, everyday language, because here in the Southwest, we have over 1 million Spanish speakers just in the state of Arizona, and we have no official U.S. language of English, so a lot of Spanish people say, hey, why can't we have everything in our language? There is no official language. You're from Quebec, from the Two Solitudes, so I would like your opinion on how choice of language relates to the First Amendment.
Well, how it relates to the First Amendment per se might better be left to a legal scholar. I don't think that the First Amendment would either protect or outlaw the use of languages other than English, but I'm not a constitutional scholar. I think there has to be some kind of eclecticism. That is, I don't think the government should ever make use of language, a particular language, illegal. Maybe that falls under the First Amendment, I don't know. I think it should provide opportunities for everyone to master English, including children in school. I think a lot of so-called bilingual education programs in the United States have been unsuccessful because they keep children in Spanish-only classes for far too long. I think education should take advantage of the fact that children are especially good at mastering language to make sure that they're exposed to English early on. But I don't think that there should be any kind of coercion, especially outside school, that would outlaw the use of language. I think whether government documents should be provided in another language should be a matter of pragmatism and common sense. If it's just a fact that there are a lot of people who aren't going to understand traffic laws in English and you're testing them for a driver's license, it's probably a better idea to have people who know the laws when licensing them than to use that as your battleground for complete English mastery. So I would prefer not to be ideological about it and treat it on a common sense basis.
This emailer asked, do you find that a child learning two languages simultaneously thinks in a different way than a monolingual child?
Probably not dramatically differently. It's certainly not true, as many people used to believe, and probably some people still believe, that being bilingual hurts you cognitively, that there used to be these myths that children would get confused, they'd be liable to learning disabilities, they would associate one language with masculine things and another one with feminine things if they learn one from ma and one from pa, all of which have turned out to be myths. What children do get in mastering two languages is probably a better appreciation of language as an object itself. That is, they know that there are these things called languages. In fact, some studies that I did many years ago showed that bilingual children are better able than monolingual children to think about language. That is, if you ask them, why do we call a cup a cup? A monolingual child will say, well, because that's where you put your coffee and it's got a handle. And a bilingual child will say, well, if you called it something else, no one would know what you're talking about. And the second answer, of course, is the correct answer. Words are arbitrary labels shared in a community. And when you know that you have to call it a cup with one group of people and something else with another group of people, you're forced to think about what language is and how it works. So that's a definite advantage of bilingualism. But I don't think it makes bilinguals think differently across the board.
Stanford, go ahead.
Hi, Stephen. Great afternoon. Thanks for taking my call, C-SPAN. Two quick questions. Firstly, you partly covered the first one in your statements about violence, but Barbara Oakley has written a book which you endorsed on the cover called Evil Genes. And my question is, do you subscribe to the concept of evil genes and therefore, of course, good genes? And the second question is, do you completely reject Skinner and the behaviorist approach? And do you really feel that there is nothing in the statement that behavior is, in fact, shaped by its consequences?
Yeah. First one, well, I think what Oakley's book specifically referred to as the phenomenon of psychopathy. These are people who seem to have no conscience from the time they're children. As kids, they often bully younger children, torture animals, lie habitually. Some of them grow up to be, a very small number grow up to be serial killers, but some grow up to be con artists and troublemakers. So the research seems to suggest that there is some small percentage, perhaps 3 to 5% of especially of men, who seem to be lacking this moral sense of conscience. And we don't know the causes, but I think it's a good bet that at least some of the cases are genetic. We know that some forms of early brain damage, especially damage to the frontal lobes, can lead to a syndrome that's a kind of acquired psychopathy. So not all the cases are genetic, but it looks like some proportion of them are. And the second question was on B.F. Skinner.
Right. Yes.
B.F. Skinner was... he was around at Harvard when I arrived as a graduate student. He was probably the world's most famous psychologist in the 1960s and early 1970s. He was an advocate of the school of thought called behaviorism, according to which a science of behavior should not worry about mental entities. So forget rules, memories, emotions, thoughts, plans, goals, desires. All of that was pseudoscientific mumbo-jumbo, like fairies and elves, that science should concentrate entirely on laws of behavior. how the frequency of behavior is influenced by the immediate stimulus situation and the past